All right. Hello, everybody. I'm Lonnie with Untitled Nerd Network, brought to you by Infinity Flux and your local Satanist, both out of the Chattanooga, Tennessee area. And we have the awesome privilege of being here with Mr. Leeman Kessler. I pronounced that right, correct?
That's right, Leeman Kessler.
Awesome. All right. You have a YouTube program called Ask Lovecraft, as we heard the little soundbite right at the beginning. And I want to I'm pretty sure most of our viewers probably aren't familiar with what you do. Give us kind of a crash course in what exactly your channel is.
Sure. So the premise of my channel is that HP Lovecraft, famed horror writer from the 1920s and 30s, is back from the dead and has reinvented himself for the 21st century as a self-help guru. He's here to answer questions, provide advice, and generally just be fairly questionable all around.
Awesome. So it was weird because you have a couple other videos where you're not actually in character. And whenever I saw that first video, I was like, "Whoa, is this like I saw your face, but you use like a whole other voice? You know, you use the I guess the European accent." And
Yeah, there's a lot of questions about what precise accent I'm doing. Some folks have said I'm trying to do a British accent. I'm not. It's if it's sort of semi mid-Atlantic. What I tend to describe it as, it's me doing a Frasier accent is really what it is. It's sort of that kind of slightly stilted, a bit forward on the tongue, but really it's supposed to kind of capture that slightly mid-century. The old sort of old-timey, coming up next on Channel 19, stay tuned for Lone Ranger, that kind of old school voice. And it came out of having to do the stage play. So I didn't start performing as HP Lovecraft just for the web series. I was in a stage play, and I had to come up with a way of speaking that was both reflective of, if not necessarily that time period, but sort of evocative of that somewhat other New Englandy. I didn't want to do like an actual like really broad New England accent, but it also had to be something that could project, that I could sort of shoot out to an audience. And so what you hear on the show is this somewhat cobbled together accent that I've created for the show.
so kind of an amalgam voice, as it were.
Cool. Yeah. Like I said, it very much leans heavily on on the Crane brothers from Frasier, with just bits of that kind of old Hollywood style.
That's kind of there you go. You're straight out of Frasier. That's where I've seen you before. You do. You kind of remind me a little bit of Kelsey Grammer.
I'll take it. It's the high forehead,
Could you do the? No, I'm not even going to ask you to do Sideshow Bob. Oh, there we go. It's pretty close. I never even thought about that. So one thing I want to know. This is something that's just bugged me to death since the first video. The little kid voice at the beginning.
Yep.
Can you tell me about that? Where did that come from?
So when I was starting this program, it was very sort of off the top of my head. I had been wanting to do some kind of web series or some kind of performance for YouTube or something. And I got the idea of doing this Ask Lovecraft show to make an advice show as HP Lovecraft. And I quickly ran around to all my friends to kind of help me put up, create art, the little kind of precious moments, HP Lovecraft that is the thumbnail for all the episodes. And because I had this sort of precious moments, kind of slightly weird, not quite kid show, but just I wanted to juxtapose the horror of HP Lovecraft with kind of cutesy kitsch. I asked friends of mine with kids or who were teachers if they could record their kids saying "Ask Lovecraft" and send that in to me so I could use their voice. And a friend of mine from college had her little boy Liam do it, and it was just so kind of put upon this like Ask Lovecraft, like, why are you asking me to say this, Mom? That's been the voice ever since. I think he's now, I don't know if he's a teenager yet, but he's getting close.
Yeah.
So I don't know how if he discovers at some point that his voice has been used for over almost and at this point over 1,000 episodes of a strange web series. Just how he'll feel about that.
I wonder if it does kind of make me wonder. Like, does he know, or maybe
I
one
think
day?
so. His mom, like, we've met up at like college reunions and stuff. She's like, "This is Leeman, whose voice is on your show," and he's kind of rolled his eyes. So I'd have to ask her if he's aware of it more recently.
Oh, so he wouldn't like be a. I was thinking, oh, he could come on there and you could talk to him. Hey, this is
He's
the
fairly
voice.
local, if his mom wants, and if it doesn't violate all of YouTube's usage of minors requirements, which I probably violate anyway the way I use my kids on the show. But
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking about that. Of course, the way you're describing it, he probably wouldn't care. He'd come on, and you'd be like, so, you're the guy that does the voice. Okay.
the literal voice of Ask Lovecraft.
Yeah, that is amazing. So, like, you touched upon it a little bit. And I kind of wondered, you do. I mean, I don't want to like go kissing your butt here or anything, but you do a really good job of portraying the character. And that was one of the first things I wondered was, do you actually have acting experience? And I guess the answer to that's yes.
I do. I studied theater. I did theater in high school, and then I studied it in college. And I was performing in. I lived in Toronto for a number of years, and I was part of a theater company out there. I also the most paid work I got as an actor was faking medical illnesses and scenarios for med students. I was a standardized patient for a number of years, but no, I had a fair amount of stage work, little bits of film, helping friends with projects and things like that. And yeah, and then the whole thing started as a stage play. A friend of mine wrote a play about Lovecraft and his marriage with Sonia Green, and that is what really started getting me more into Lovecraft himself and interested in Lovecraft as a character. And then a separate friend who had seen me in this play, he had a web series. His name was Derek the Bard, and he had a show called Chasing the Muse, which was kind of a pop culture review show. And he was going to do a summer of Lovecraft in the summer of 2012. And he was like, well, I'm going to be reviewing all these Lovecraftian things. I'm going to be reviewing The Laundry Files by Charlie Strauss, and I'm going to be reviewing, In the Mouth of Madness and all the Stuart Gordon films. I know someone who can dress up and do a passable HP Lovecraft impression. Why don't I have him come on the show as HP Lovecraft and have HP Lovecraft, talking about how he feels about Stuart Gordon and how he feels about The Mouth of Madness. And so we recorded these little vignettes in his kitchen. And so Lovecraft kept popping up in his kitchen, to waggle his finger and be like, how dare you? And that was what really planted the bug in my head of, I like this character, and I like playing this character out of context, because I'd done the stage play, which is very, Lovecraft in his time, dealing with his marriage. But the sort of Lovecraft fish out of water character was different, and it was someone I could play with and tweak. And Lovecraft is such a fascinating figure that it gives me, as an actor, it gives me a lot that I can play with, a lot that I can kind of run around with, and I've had a lot of fun with it ever since. And that's been over 6 years now. Well, okay, it's been 6 years with the web series and about almost 8 years with the performing as him on stage.
God, has it been that long? I mean, we'll get to the first video I saw you in shortly. I do want to remind everybody that if you're watching this live at 9 p.m. on Wednesday, the 22nd, we are taking chat questions, comments, concerns, that kind of thing. And Glenn is doing a great job in there as moderating the chat. And we do have a few people in here saying hello and things like that, giving a little bit of feedback. We got a fella here named Crashmancer who says, this is actually kind of some audio critique. Mr. Kessler ought to deactivate desktop audio going into his streaming software, make it just record his output.
It's okay. It's telling me it's coming through my Yeti. It's coming through my microphone here.
How does he know that? Just by watching the stream? I thought he was talking about your actual web series.
Oh, yeah. I'm unsure what because I've got everything plugged in here. I'm hearing it through as the audio sort of coming at you too hot.
I mean,
I'll sort of tweak. I'll sort of tweak it, but
I'm hearing it pretty good. But I mean, worst come to worst, I can lower the volume on my
yeah,
end if they need us
yeah,
to do that.
yeah. I don't know where else it would be coming in from. Keep playing with it on mine, and if it
It
sounds
could be on
remarkably
mine.
different,
We're because now I'm showing you and I are about the same level. You were a little hot there,
okay,
but we'll see if that fixed it.
okay.
Let me see because that was like the one thing that I kind of latched onto. God Almighty! Like Glenn's in there giving all kinds of HP Lovecraft trivia. Like he was born on this date and whatever year, and
Well, it's his birthday was just 2 days ago, so we are very. This is a nice timely, the
how
date
awkward was that?
to
To sing
discuss
happy
Lovecraft
birthday to
and
yourself.
all of his shenanigans.
How awkward was that to sing happy birthday to yourself at the beginning of that
Oh,
video?
that you know what? I think that was a little cheap of me because I'm pretty sure I've done that same gag before.
What, like last year before last?
Sometime I remember there was one of my early episodes for I don't know if it was the first time it was his birthday. It may have been. It may have been the very first time I was recording on his actual birthday. I had a bunch of my friends who some of them who were actor friends, some of them who had their own web series. I had them record themselves just turning down an invitation to come hang out with HP Lovecraft on his birthday.
Wow.
And with Lovecraft feeling very dejected and lonely. That was wow, that may actually have been like back in 2013, maybe. Yeah, it was a while back. So it's so funny. You talked about the first episode that you saw,
Yes.
and I went back. I was like, I have almost no memory of some of these things. There's a few that stand out. Some of the ones that get a lot of play, or if I get a notification that someone's left a comment on it 5 years later. Um, but sometimes I'll go back and be like, what on earth was this like, especially the voice, because the voice has changed over time. Like it got to
It
its
has
sort of
because
final form. I'd say maybe about 3 years in, but maybe sooner than that. It was when I started reading his letters, I began to have a better sense of his voice, and I think that impacted the actual audio quality. Because early on, it was really based on having done the stage play and a kind of sort of parodic notion of Lovecraft. It wasn't really until I sat down with a whole whackload of his letters that I saw just how much more fascinating a figure he was, how much more sort of emotional dynamic range he had. I think there's this idea out there in fandom of Lovecraft as this kind of you know pallid individual afraid of outsiders and afraid of people, who like locks himself in his room and never comes out. This sort of antisocial misanthrope, and part of that's he projected himself as this guy who was put upon by the world, and he called himself grandpa when from when he was like in his 30s. But the truth of the matter is he was incredibly charming and incredibly charismatic and incredibly engaging and self-deprecating and catty. He had this incredible wit and humor that comes across in his letter. They're often paired with his incredibly problematic racial views and social views, but that's that uh, still that wit and that charm is very at odds with, again, this notion I think people have of Lovecraft as this kind of basement dwelling troglodyte who's seeing monsters in the corners. He was incredibly lively, and incredibly engaged with the world. Traveled as much as he could, and was married to an incredibly vivacious woman, so Sonia Green, who I think that had to have an impact on him. It had to sort of bring him out of his sort of isolation, or whatever sort of tendencies he had towards introversion. Yeah, I know he was a social guy, and so I definitely, when I learned that and was able to kind of see that it affected the voice, it made it so that the show was less about this kind of guy in the modern age, running in fear at the sight of airplanes and taxi cabs, but instead someone who is able to take in the modern world with a sort of like suspicion but also fascination. Lovecraft exists at the intersection of a lot of contradictions. Here's someone who would talked about how he'd feel most comfortable living in the 18th century, wearing periwigs and pantaloons and all this stuff, but is also someone who's trying to following like the bleeding edge of astronomical technology and where the sciences are going. someone who again presents himself as this kind of autodidact misanthrope, but who is very social and who is spent a good portion of his grocery money on correspondence. By the end of his life, he had dozens of correspondents that he was writing with and writing daily letters to, just tons and tons.
Wow.
We look at the amount that he's written, like in terms of fiction, and then we look at the letters that he wrote, and there's no comparison. You should see some of the letters I have here that he and Robert Howard, the creator of Conan, wrote to each other. They're these massive like books they're essentially mailing back to each and forth to each other, yelling at each other and arguing politics and arguing history.
Wow, I bet that's kind of like a 19th century message board or something.
Well, it's funny. This is actually I talk about Lovecraft as kind of the prototype of the forum moderator. Because not only was he corresponding with people and engaging with people, but he was connecting people. He was like, "Oh, you're interested in doing illustrations? Well, you need to know about this editor and this magazine that's looking for people. And oh, you're writing these stories? Well, let me get you in touch with it." Like he was sitting like a spider at the intersection of all these relationships, and that's I don't know. I think that's an image of Lovecraft that gets lost as people sort of try to present him as this kind of legendary, solitary figure. And part of what I do is sort of poke fun at Lovecraft, obviously, and poke little, needle him in ways that he deserves. But I also want to spread that image of him as more lively, more engaged, more witty, that I think gets lost.
I will say, it's just aside from just a couple of characters just created and some minor works and stuff, until I saw your videos, I've never read Lovecraft. I still haven't read any of his work. I've read a lot about his work, but I've never actually read the works themselves. I've never, up until we were prepping for this interview, I'd never read about his life. I never read really anything. And I didn't even know that his works never really were appreciated like so many artists are until well after his passing. He never really got that recognition, and he was pretty much lived in poverty his last few years. He ended up spending all of his inheritance and.
Well, so Lovecraft was sort of born, to the manner born. He was born to a very wealthy New England family. His mother's family was very old blood, Rhode Island stock, and his father was a sort of successful businessman, but very early on, sort of tragedy struck the family. His grandfather died. And the estates got mismanaged, and a lot of that inheritance was lost. His father was put in an institution. Some say for exhaustion. Others suggest maybe it was syphilis or some other much more sort of dark, at least more scandalous reason. And yeah, his family, he went from being used to and accustomed to this kind of aristocratic upbringing to living sort of in these cramped quarters with his mother and his aunts, living on a very small allowance, and never holding down a full-time job. He went from essentially being supported by his mother to being supported by his wife. He lived in New York, but never got real work in New York. Eventually went back to Rhode Island, was divorced sort of from Sonia, and made a little bit of money selling stories to the pulp magazines like Weird Tales, and made most of his sort of real money doing revision work. Essentially, people would have a story idea or write something of a story, or sort of have written certain amount of poetry, and then he would improve them or at least make them something that could be published. And he did that was essentially, I think, his main source of income until he finally died. And yeah, by the end he was practically starving himself. His diet was infamously expired cans of beans and spaghetti, and yeah, he definitely had that kind of that tragic artist, unappreciated in his own time. But the fact is he's known because of these networks he created. His art thrived and survived because, high school kids he was writing letters with and talking with eventually kind of grew up and took it upon themselves to really push to make his stuff last. August Derleth, Robert Bloch, Robert Shea. There's this whole kind of group of kids and young writers who kind of looked up to Grandpa and were kind of in his orbit. They were the ones who strove to kind of get his stuff out there, and eventually it would get much broader kind of pop cultural support through people like Stephen King talking about him, Neil Gaiman, the role playing game. I mean, I think Sandy Peterson has probably done more for Lovecraft's legacy than almost any singular figure. Getting Cthulhu out there as this pop cultural icon, showing up in the D&D Deities and Demigods handbook back in the 80s.
That was where I heard. I didn't even know it was a Lovecraft creation.
No, I mean, I knew Call of Cthulhu because it was one of the secret societies in the Steve Jackson Illuminati card game. And Illuminati New World Order. So like I'd heard Cthulhu as from the servants of Cthulhu, but I didn't know about Lovecraft until probably college. I think at one point I picked up a copy of the old Mythos card game. It was a collectible card game back in the explosion of card games during the 90s. And yeah, some folks had made essentially an HP Lovecraft CCG. And I was like, oh, this has weird aliens and like magic books in it. I'll get it. Necronomicon. Oh, that's the thing from Army of Darkness. Sure, I'll check this out. It's interesting. I mean, Necronomicon. That's the other thing, right? I mean, that's something he created that got huge pop cultural play, and you find Necronomicons all over the place. I was just playing a new Steam game, Graveyard Keeper, and they just introduced the Necronomicon as a plot point. And it's become such a huge thing that people assume Lovecraft stole it from somewhere else, or was copying the Necronomicon from somewhere else, or there is an actual Necronomicon that exists because someone actually published it and you can find it.
Because whenever I saw, the first time I ever saw The Evil Dead, and they had the Necronomicon, my first thought, this was mid to late 90s when it was VHS was still the thing, and I was like, oh man, and of course, back before the internet really took off, all you had was like schoolyard rumor and this person heard this and this person heard that. And you had really no way to verify it. And, that was the word. Oh, man, there was really a Necronomicon from, Eastern Europe, or, it's some kind of weird thing from hundreds of years ago that got lost. And, that's it right there. It's interesting because I had absolutely no clue that Howard Lovecraft had created all that.
And it's funny because Lovecraft was playing in these worlds, and like in this correspondence with all of these friends, like they would essentially kind of do quasi role playing within these worlds. Like they would kind of, call themselves the hierarch of Nyarlathotep and, all this kind of thing. They would, talk about the rituals under the bloody moon. And then they would borrow from each other. Robert Howard would make use of some element of Lovecraft's work. Lovecraft would borrow heavily from Howard or borrow heavily from Chambers. I mean, talk about sort of stolen legacy. Whenever people think about Carcosa or The King in Yellow, they associate it with Lovecraft, not with Robert Chambers, who actually came up with it. So this stuff is very fluid. And I mean, one thing is I think Lovecraft is rightfully appreciated for how he synthesized lots of different elements of horror and brought it together and sort of fused horror and science fiction in an interesting way. But he was also someone who was very much taking what writers around him were doing, right? He was sort of taking Edgar Allan Poe and Chambers and Dunsany and Machen and Ambrose Bierce, all these kind of bigger writers and fusing them together to create his own unique Lovecraftian what have you. But again, much like this sort of image of him as this kind of solitary troglodyte, I think people kind of view him as this, mad genius who all of this stuff kind of sprung out of his head. And he was very much part of a tradition and part of a continuum of how horror and pulp and storytelling was evolving in the early 20th century.
He was way ahead of his time.
Yeah, I mean, like, he was ahead of his time, but he was still part of his time. I mean, he was still taking these sort of elements of what was around him and bringing them together. And I think, and because of I think a large part of it is that he has a very distinctive name, HP Lovecraft. It's not, Bob Jones. And so you're able to talk about like Lovecraftian fiction and like works of Lovecraft. I don't know. There's something very evocative about it. I mean, there's a reason I do Ask Lovecraft and not Ask Chambers or Ask Dunsany or Ask Howard. Lovecraft has an interesting spell that he casts upon folks in the horror world, in fandom. And that's usually good. Sometimes, as fandom can often get, there's a certain toxicity that's bred. But it's fascinating. And it's fascinating to come at it as an actor. Again, I wasn't reading Lovecraft until my 20s. I really wasn't studying Lovecraft until I was performing as him. And so that gives you a very different take as opposed to the folks who did discover him when they were teenagers, did discover them when, like they were, walking around and found like an old yellowed, copy of Rats in the Walls on their dad's bookshelf. And I think, someone who sort of has grown up with Lovecraft and views him as very much sort of an intimate part of their fandom can get very defensive about Lovecraft's legacy, especially some of the controversies that surround Lovecraft. But it's been fantastic to be part of it. I love this community. I love the folks who put on some of the great conventions like the HP Lovecraft Film Festival. They just did a version of it out in Rhode Island. The Necronomicon, which is an amazing convention out in Rhode Island. There's a lot of just really great people who are interested in weirdness and that intersection of the horrible with the wonderful. That kind of awe and terror. And I think that's Lovecraft at its best. And, in the last few years, we've seen this, really interesting explosion of books by people of color, by women, by queer authors who are, taking Lovecraft, which, existed for such a long time in this very white male kind of straitjacketed world, and are playing with it and teasing it apart and able to tell real stories of strangeness and weirdness in ways that just wasn't possible, just a few short years ago. So this is an exciting time to be wearing H.P. Lovecraft's, flesh mask and dancing around for folks.
Oh yeah, definitely. And I was actually, we've covered your, kind of the beginnings of your channel, how you got started, and why you portray Lovecraft. I want to talk about. Man, we're almost halfway done already. Oh, no. I want to talk to you about the first time I ever ran across your channel. And we actually had I had a guy that I worked with who was like a counselor, I think. And his last name was Flanagan. And he came up to me one day at work. He says, "Hey," because I was still really kind of struggling to find an idea because I wanted to get on YouTube or do some online stuff, and I was still kind of in that limbo where I didn't really know what I wanted to do yet. And he said, "Hey, the kind of stuff that you write, you do all kinds of different things." And he said, I actually had a question answered on this video series that I watched, and he emailed me the link to it. I said, "Okay, I'll get around to it." A couple of days later, I was sitting around. I was like, "Oh, let's check this out." And I watched it, and it probably, that video, it doesn't seem to me like it was one of the ones that really jump out at you. It was just kind of one of the, one of your typical videos that you probably recorded and didn't really put a whole lot of effort to it. And it sounded like it was on what they call cryptogeography, which is the kind of the coming and going of land masses, small islands and stuff on maps. Like, the 2012 map will have this Pacific island. The 2013 map, it's not there. And the 2014, there it is again. Something along those lines. And I guess that concerned him to some extent. He wanted to know your thoughts on it. And you gave him your thoughts on it, which I think was the extent of it's kind of the equivalent of like a misprint or a typo or an error. Don't worry about it. You're really putting too much thought into this. And if I'm not mistaken, you were just battling some kind of a cold or flu.
Yeah, I went back and watched it. I was like, "Whoa, what is wrong?" And then I said in the episode, like, "Oh, I have some bronchial infection or something like that."
Yeah, I mean that video. Um, and if you go back and look, number one, it made me a fan, and then that for whatever reason that was the one video of yours that I watched probably a dozen times over the next year or two, and then uh, I'd say probably about a year ago I started watching a few more of them here and there, and I subscribed and all that good stuff, and then I was sitting around, a couple of weeks ago, and I was like, God, I want to interview this guy. Surely he's approachable. And sure enough, yeah, we made it happen, and here we are. But do you remember anything at all about what it went into that video? I know instead of your, I say like fancy, well-to-do background of your
Oh,
shelves and your books and
yes.
stuff, that was
It's
like
back in
almost like a
the dark days of my bed sheet.
yeah, it was like a white screen. Oh, it was a bed sheet.
Yeah. So when I first started recording, I think I first did it in a hallway, and my wife recorded and then got really tired of having to do like 80 takes, and said, find some other way to do this. So I started, what did I do? Oh, I had two tuffets, like two footstools stacked on top of each other with like a bunch of like DVD cases wedging the camera. And the camera at this point was an old like flip cam. That was like weird little like single camera things that you could like, could hold maybe like an hour worth of footage, and you pushed a button and your USB port shot out. You could, plug it into a, computer and download stuff. That was how I originally shot. And yeah, I just would, balance it on the tuffets and then get in front of a bed sheet that I had taped up over, either the wall or the door or wherever I was performing. Eventually, we moved into a place that had decent bookshelves, and I was like, "Oh, why don't I just film in front of these bookshelves? I can put all like my horror stuff behind it, and maybe a few
Oh
kind
yeah.
of jokey things." Yes, and that actually cut down my production time in about half, because the amount of time it was taking me to tape up the bed sheet and make sure the wrinkles weren't really awful and make sure it was actually covering the space so you couldn't see any wall. I spent an inordinate amount of time doing bed sheet work. um, yeah, and you know, back then I was still sort of this. I think I looked at it and it was like March of 2013. So the show was not even a year old yet. I think at this point I had discovered his letters, so I was starting to kind of get a better sense of his voice, his personality. But yeah, I mean, as you said, it doesn't seem like I had much thought in it. My production style is very fast, because very foolishly early on, I decided I wanted to do 3 episodes a week, and with very little buffer, because I wanted to be topical, apparently. So, what tends to happen is, these come out Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. So, Sunday night, Tuesday night, Thursday night, I find a letter, or I film, and then they go up the next day. So like tonight, that's when we're done. I'm going to go look through the emails and look through the messages I have and find a question that is interesting, is not too similar to one I've done, recently, is not sent by someone who I've answered recently. I try to parse these things out. And then if I can come up with like 1 or 2 little gags or beats to answer it, that'll be enough. And I'll just let it percolate overnight. And then, tomorrow, as I'm going about the kind of my morning and taking care of my kids or in the shower, I'll sort of begin to kind of formulate what beats I want to hit, what jokes I want to make. And by that point, I've got about 2 minutes worth of material that I feel like I can work with. And then while my children are sleeping, or I've got them in front of the television with the volume down low, I run into this room, as folks can see. They can see the shelf behind me. Set up my camera and I film. And filming can take anywhere from 5 minutes to an hour, depending on how much sort of editing I do, how many takes it takes, if the dog starts barking in the middle of a take, which happens. If my daughter busts into the room because Doc McStuffins froze up on the DVD player and I got to fix it. So, and then I shoot it out and it's ready to go on that Monday, Wednesday or Friday. So it's a very fast turnaround. And it had to be because I'm very lazy. And if I had set up a project that required a lot of production, a lot of editing, I wouldn't do it. Like, I just know how my brain works and how I approach projects, and projects that like require a great deal of like forethought and foreplanning don't get done. So,
Oh yeah.
you know, this has meant that I've been able to churn stuff out really quickly. I leave it to the audience to decide what they feel about my production values. They do keep going up, once I got like a nicer camera, once I got an actual microphone. They do improve steadily once I got rid of the bed sheet. But but that's allowed me to do so many of these things. So it is hard for me to remember specific episodes because at this point, 6 years later, there have been I think 1,000 episodes. I think I passed 1,000 some time ago. I'll do a quick look at the video count up here. Yeah. So I'm over 1,000 by this point. Because again, 3 a week. With 50 50 odd weeks a year. Over 6 years, again, that all adds up. And I went on hiatus once, like one summer. I think I went on a trip, my family in Nashville. So I went to go visit family. And so I was away for like maybe 2 or 3 weeks. And I came back and my subscriptions had just plummeted.
Oh, wow.
I had walked away and everyone's like, well, I guess the show is dead. I was like, no, I'm back. Look, I've got a facial hair. I've introduced a new evil twin character. And so I've tried to never have any missed any dead air since. So what I've done is I film live shows, or I'll do sort of special interviews with people when I'm at cons, and I'll save those, and that'll be my buffer. And sometimes the things I use as filler are very tangentially related. Most recently, over the summer, I aired a live show I did as Carl Sagan. And I justified having that on the show since Carl Sagan has appeared on Ask Lovecraft. So I'm like, it's he's a character. I can make this sort of work. Other times I've had friends over to play board games like Arkham Horror in character as HP Lovecraft, and I filmed that and shared that. I'm pretty shameless. I'll do what it takes to to find filler material.
I bet HP Lovecraft would be a heck of a dungeon master.
Well, that's going to be the next thing, right? If I maybe go out, if I can con the people at Gen Con or Origins to bring me out to run Call of Cthulhu or Trail of Cthulhu in character, that'd be a real dream.
I do have a question on here.
Sure.
Let's see. Now we kind of touched on this as far as Lovecraft. I don't know if this is a typo. Have you done a character called PH Lovecraft?
Yes. So okay, PH Lovecraft is the evil twin of HP Lovecraft.
Okay, I thought that was kind of a typo, and I was going to be like, "Oh, we've already done the HP Lovecraft," but no. Okay, I missed that then. Let's see. Crashmancer wants to know, where did the idea for your other characters, PH Lovecraft and Carl Sagan, come from?
Okay, so PH Lovecraft came from that trip to Nashville, where because I wasn't having to act, I was able to not shave, and I had a bit of a goatee and mustache, and I came back and was like, oh, I can totally do Star Trek and have an evil twin, and so I created the character of PH Lovecraft. And originally the idea was just to do kind of a one-off silly goof, but then I thought, no, I kind of like this character, and I had a really obnoxious kind of like maroon jacket, and so when I need to be PH, because I can't just grow facial hair on a whim. When I need to be PH, I put on the maroon jacket, and PH is really fun because, PH is everything HP isn't. He's a very sophisticated man who's a man of the world. He's very lively and interested in living life to its fullest. And he lets me do commentary on Lovecraft in an interesting way, do kind of critique of Lovecraft. I've only ever done one really specific episode on Lovecraft's racism, my episode Sober Reflection. And that is done from the point of view of PH commenting on it. Ooh. And sort of giving the show's policy as regards HP Lovecraft. I mean, this is something I talk about very openly. I wrote a big essay called On Portraying a White Supremacist, which, it details how you do that. How do you kind of enter into the mind of, someone who, thought and believed and wrote really hateful, odious things, and yet is also this very beloved, cornerstone of modern horror. And, my policy has always been to be very open about it, to be willing to discuss it. We don't make apologies for his racism. We don't call him a man of his time, but we also don't dwell on it, right? Like we're not, putting him up to the lash and sort of flogging him for it.
Almost like Walt Disney.
and I don't, and I also don't make every episode about it,
Yeah.
but it's touched on, and certainly out of character, it's something that I discuss, and I'm always willing to discuss because I think there's this idea that there's a fear of talking about Lovecraft's sort of racial views and a fear that it's going to turn people off or it's going to like sort of, harm his legacy. But honestly, I think the more open and honest we can be, the
Yeah.
more we can sort of, address it and wrestle with it. Again, it allows for some great conversations to come about. Some really great art has been created because of people sort of playing with the Lovecraft's racial views and either subverting them or moving past them. And I think it's a very important thing to do. And so PH allows me to do that in a way so it's not just HP Lovecraft being like, yes, I was incredibly racist. The other thing PH lets me do, which is actually very useful and is very nice, is he's how I do book reviews. So I have people who will send me books, and I also have friends who are writers, and I'll get their books. And so I will review books for the show. And I don't want to do it as HP Lovecraft because that's sort of weird. Like HP Lovecraft hated my book, or like HP Lovecraft really likes my book. But if this sort of strange demonic entity PH Lovecraft offers kind of color commentary on stuff, well, that's a little different. And that's been a lot of fun. So there's a whole within the channel. The channel has different kind of sort of subsections. I have a whole subsection that's just called PH Reads a Thing, where it's his, reviewing books. I just did a huge, big series all about Jeff Vandermeer's Southern Reach trilogy. So the movie Annihilation with Natalie Portman, that was based on the first book in that series. And yeah, it lets me break things up. Same thing with Carl Sagan. Carl Sagan's what happens when I don't cut my hair, and so it gets really like belled out. I bring Carl Sagan in and have him talk about, the cosmos and all of its wonders. And let's see, who else have I done? The other recurring character on the show is hapless producer and assistant Leeman Kessler, who's kind of the Scooter of the show, kind of like Scooter from the Muppet Show. So he's very put upon. He's very overworked. He doesn't understand what's going on. Why is he here? And that just lets me make fun of myself and do kind of more tongue in cheek back and forth. Have conversations with Lovecraft. There was a great episode of my own program. There was an episode I really had fun making where Lovecraft goes missing. His wife Sonia, an actress who portrayed Sonia, sent in a really great video. And so I had Lovecraft respond by running away. And then the next episode was Leeman Kessler dressed as HP Lovecraft, pretending to be HP Lovecraft. So essentially it was me playing myself, impersonating HP Lovecraft, but having to do a really bad HP Lovecraft impression. And that was a very fun acting exercise. And yeah, and that's most of them. Oh, I've done Leeman Kessler from when I worked at Blockbuster. So I've done, 15-year-old Leeman Kessler has appeared as a character. And there's been a few other folks that I've kind of like, dropped in here and there. But that's, the PH, Carl Sagan, and Leeman are the main kind of recurring foils to HP. And that just lets me do different things and get a chance to play around a little bit more.
Now, I know we were, I don't know, did you ever watch anime? Or
Yep.
Okay. I know you're familiar with, especially if it's an anime that's been around for a little while, and somebody's like, "Oh, you really ought to watch this," like Dragon Ball Z or something. You sit down to episode 1. I wonder how many's on here, and it's like 37 years worth at like
That's right.
128 episodes a year, and you're like, "How do I even begin?" That's like what happened with me, because whenever I started really watching your stuff over the last few weeks, like really watching, and I was going to go back to the beginning, and I looked at your video list, and you had like 1,008 videos. I was like, we might just have to hit the highlights on this one.
Yeah, it's a lot, and it's 3 a week adds up.
Yeah. Now, I mean, there are. I'd say I've watched probably 25 to 30 of your videos over the last few weeks, and like actually today, I just kind of turned on the playlist. It was playing them in really no particular order. And so the one called Sonya popped up.
Yep.
And I'm sitting here typing stuff on the computer, sending messages, emails, and I'm listening to it. And about a minute in, I close out everything else I'm doing and I bring it up to actually watch it because it wasn't what I expected. Most of your stuff has a really humorous vibe to it. There was a little bit right there towards the beginning where you mentioned to Sonia about, well, I know you'll keep my letters hidden and nobody will ever read them and stuff like that. And I'm like, oh, yeah, we kind of know how that turned out. And but then it turns into a really serious, just kind of outpouring from the heart. And I'm like, wow, like I was actually kind of touched by it. And I'm reading the comments, and people are just, it's a very highly rated video, compared to a lot of the others. And you really kind of struck a chord with people. Can you talk about that video and where
Yeah.
the inspiration came and kind of what made you go the serious route with it?
Well, because the video began. This actress Stella Brewster, who's a fantastic actor, blogger. She and on a whim, put together a video of Sonia Green getting reanimated herself and discovering Ask Lovecraft and reaching out to HP Lovecraft. So it was like my first like spinoff, I guess, or fan project. And she sent it and it was really touching. And so I wanted to do right by that. And so, of course, the first thing I did was make a goof about Lovecraft seeing this and running away. And so the first episode is like literally half of it is just an empty room, and then you sort of see hear a door slam and you see me running outside. Like I set out the camera, to out the window for that. And then the second episode was that goofy, me impersonating myself, impersonating Lovecraft, doing a bad impression of H.P. Lovecraft. So again, very gaggy, very wah wah. And then, but I wanted it to end on a very different note, and I wanted to actually address what she'd asked. She'd asked about the fact that Lovecraft, and this is true, they were separated, and she sent him divorce papers, which he never signed. And she went on to get remarried and all this sort of stuff. People eventually pointed out, like you're still technically married to Lovecraft because he never signed that. And she got very upset. And so I wanted to kind of like, why would someone not do that? Why would you not sign these papers? And it was something that got touched on very briefly in the stage play, which was a very serious look at their relationship. And the kind of the horror story of the relationship. I mean, it was a fictional account. The artist took some liberties, but he also based it on kind of her memoirs of their time together. What letters did exist. She, as you just hinted to, she burned a lot of their letters and correspondence, so we don't know a lot about their relationship. But I wanted to kind of touch on that and this idea of, when people think of Lovecraft, they think of fear. They think of his big line about how, the oldest and strongest emotion of mankind is fear of the unknown. And he's a horror writer who talks about fear. And, he's written this massive essay and sort of literary discussion of fear and horror and how we actually approach fear. It's kind of his main thing. But, fear is not just like, oh, there are demons in the walls and like, oh, what if the cosmos doesn't care about me? Fear is fear of change, fear of moving on, fear of being vulnerable to others. And so, I like to every now and then be able to touch on that and to have there be some seriousness, some realness. And it's playing, I tried to approach every, question with a certain degree of respect and like, okay, how can I answer this without just kind of, being too flippant or too kind of, dismissive. And so that was a way I felt that I could do honor to that question, do honor to, to that relationship, because I think the relationship of Lovecraft and Sonia Green is a really fascinating one. I mean, here you have this virulent anti-Semitic, anti-immigrant just boob, and he's marrying this vivacious Ukrainian Jewish immigrant, woman who's like, already survived one awful marriage, and has a child and like is making a life for her own in New York. She's supporting a whole bunch of writers. Like, she's someone who is like a dedicated to the craft of writing, is a writer herself. One of the tragedies of Lovecraft is that because he looms so large in people's minds, this really fascinating figure, Sonia Green, has been reduced just to the role of Lovecraft's wife, when she's so much more. She's such a, just amazing historical figure,
Oh yeah.
from, someone who should have been, had everything kind of, against her coming into this country, when she did, and yet is, she thrived in a way that Lovecraft, born with all the advantages in the world, couldn't thrive, and so that, again, that juxtaposition is really fascinating, and I've had a lot of fun. Exploring that. And I'm really excited because Stella Brewster, the actress who sent that in, she's done other things, and she's continued kind of exploring portrayals of Sonia and talking about Sonia, and I'm really excited to see kind of where that goes, because that's a really fascinating program in its own right.
I will say, if you're wondering what we're talking about, check out his video. It's actually Ask Lovecraft Sonia, Sonia. Don't do it right now. Wait till after this is over. But like real quick, if you don't mind me asking, like with the seriousness of that, I mean, I know you have acting and everything, but with how you feel about the man himself and just the realness of it, was that difficult at all recording that?
It's hard to remember. I remember if that's the one I filmed in an attic, so I had to like change where I was doing my filming for that. Or is it no? It was me popping out of a closet. It was me popping out of the closet. I've done different things. I've explored a lot of different places and locations to do filming. No, I think finding that emotional spot and that realness is part of my training as an actor. And people talk. There's an old saying that drama is easy and comedy is hard. For drama, you just be like, my mom died and I don't know I just don't know how to go forward, and I'm trying to figure out just where to get my life. Whereas comedy, it's like, hey, a pie in my face, is that funny? It's trying to find these different levels is it's a challenge. It's an acting challenge, but it's one I like to think I've been trained to do. And I don't remember that one being too hard to film. Stuff that's hard to film is stuff that's very overly technical or has a lot of beats and a lot of information that I get kind of garbled in my head. Probably the absolute most difficult thing I filmed was I did an entire episode as it was the same forwards and backwards. So I had to like actually memorize a script for it, and most of these are mostly improvised. Again, I know what beats I'm going to hit, but I don't write anything down for this. But yeah, I did one episode essentially as a kind of a verbal palindrome, and it was that was a challenge. I don't know. Every now and then I set these really awful tasks for myself. That was definitely one of them.
That was not one that was done in 5 minutes with one take.
No. Although that didn't take as many takes as I thought it would, but it took some because I had to like really know where I was going.
Before, we're actually less than 10 minutes from the end. Can you believe it? It really, yeah, we're definitely gonna have to do this again. Let me see. What do we got going on here? Okay, we got some different things going on about Lovecraft in the chat, and giving out a bunch of info. I really appreciate Glenn for that, because kind of extracurricular reading. I mean, seriously, Lovecraft is very interesting. I mean, you could read for a year and never touch the same thing twice. And you could watch your channel for a year and never touch it.
I don't recommend it. I think after a while you need to call a doctor in, because it can get a little much.
What I want to talk real quick about your nerd hobbies. That's something that I was planning on covering with about half the video, and now here we go with less than 10 minutes to go. So in general, I mean, you talked about having like a Steam account. You play Steam games.
Yeah.
I'm assuming you watch maybe the current like Marvel movies, as does everybody.
I'm woefully behind. I have not seen Black Panther or Infinity Wars. I did finally see the latest Thor, which I because I have small children, getting out to see kind of the big things is harder. I do try to see all the Star Warses. I'm a dedicated Star Wars nerd, so I definitely get out for all of those. But the Marvel movies, I tend to take a bit more of my time. It's not something I rush out for.
Okay. So by the way, Infinity War is amazing. Like I made it a point to go get like the 4K Blu-ray from Best
Oh.
Buy the day it came out because I went and saw it in theaters twice, three times, and
Oh,
then
dang. Okay.
yeah, immediately when it came out, I was like, I have to get this again. So okay, so not totally up to date on new movies. Um, but like, what else do you? I mean, you enjoy? Is I'm assuming you're just a PC gamer.
Yeah. So, I used to do more console gaming. Now I'm mostly Steam games when sort of children allow. I tend to like a lot of games like this new game Graveyard Keeper, which is sort of like a farm simulator, sort of like a Stardew Valley, only you're running a graveyard and a cemetery, which is fun. But I like classics like Age of Empires and the Fallout series. I do a lot of RPG and tabletop stuff. I run a D&D game when time permits, and I have a semi-regular board game night. Very into kind of nerdy board games, not like the big complicated Civil War reenactment type board games where it's like 18 hours and you've got to like have a dedicated table space, but kind of the Euro game or sort of nerd game stuff, Fury of Dracula, Archipelago, Seven Wonders, stuff like that. And then I'm also I'm a big podcast junkie. That's been my sort of recent big excursion into new realms of fandom. I really love comedy podcasts. I'm really enjoying the current podcast that's all about The Good Place, the fantastic NBC show. And other than that, I'm a co-host on a horror podcast called Miskatonic Musing. So I watch a fair amount of horror movies and read horror stories for that. We just did a watch of Train to Busan, which as a parent of children was hard for me to watch, but is a fantastic Korean zombie movie. So I'm definitely got my fingers in lots of nerd pies. Jack of all trades, as it were.
Okay, cool. Now I want to talk about some of your upcoming plans. Uh, can can you maybe give us a preview of what to expect on the channel over the next week or two?
Well, I can't really tell you what's going to happen in any given episode because, like I said, I don't know until I go check my email the night before.
Oh, so you don't even
So
have the next episode.
I don't have any major events coming up. No major sort of big multi-arc storylines coming up the pipeline. So it's always a discovery for all of us. There's a couple of different conventions that are coming down the pike that I'm hoping I can get out to. It'll just sort of depend on scheduling. The one that's for sure going to be happening will be around the Cleveland area next spring, and then I'm definitely going to make it out to Necronomicon 2019 in Rhode Island next August. I had to miss it last year for the what I like to think was the very good reason of my son being born. But this next time I'm going to definitely get out there for that. And yeah, hopefully I'll pick up some other live shows. I'm in rural Ohio, which makes it a little hard to hit a lot of cons. But my hope is to get a chance to do a bit more performing now that my kids are a bit older. Get out and do a bit more live shows.
Awesome. All right. Well, I was going to say, let's talk about some of your social media and stuff. I actually have your YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter, all
Great.
three listed underneath your.
That's the best place. Facebook is a big place, especially if folks are interested in kind of a lot of behind the scenes stuff. I have a Facebook fan group called the Ask Lovecraft Appreciation Society. That's kind of the best sort of hub. Otherwise, LeemanKessler.com has a lot of information about things we've talked about on this show and upcoming live events.
Okay, I'm actually sitting here writing down the Appreciation Society down in my notebook, so I remember to go like it. I actually forgot about it. I haven't had an opportunity to go and hit that like button yet, so I urge everybody on here to do the same. And one very last thing we talk about, and then after we end the interview, I'll talk to you for just a second after the fact.
Sure thing.
You do. I've seen at the very end of your videos, you have your email address, which is I think like asklovecraft@gmail. And
Yep.
then you also have a PO box. Do you get a lot of physical snail mail letters?
It depends. It definitely confused the post office when they started showing up. Occasionally, folks will send actual real letters, which I love. Lovecraft being a big pen and paper correspondent. I love the idea of actually receiving letters and being able to kind of address that. Folks will have sent me some interesting things. There's a little carving of Cthulhu someone once sent me. I get books. Things to review that way. And it's a nice way for folks to reach out.
Okay, awesome. I love it because I've never, there's a lot of people who are kind of old fashioned and, they're like, I remember there was a radio host several years back who wouldn't even answer emails.
Oh,
I think it was, are you familiar with Robert D. Rayford?
Vaguely.
Yeah, he used to, he passed away just a year or two ago, but he used to work on the John Boy and Billy show, radio show out of Charlotte. And he refused to answer email for the longest. He actually did all of his news on a typewriter. And I mean, it was, he's like one of the old fashioned guys. But, it's interesting because yours is the first channel in a very long time who actually offers a physical mailing address.
Well, I think it was because folks were asking about book reviews and things like that, and I wanted to, have a place where folks could just sort of see and send that to if they wanted to. And I think it did actually come out of the fact that I had a PO box, so I didn't have to give my home address to people.
I completely understand
that. So that helped. And so that's been a lot of fun. I like being able to connect with folks, and I have a really, doing what I do is very niche. There's not a lot of folks who are particularly interested in the musings of an 128-year-old dead horror writer. But the fans I do have are incredibly lovely. They're incredibly warm, and I've been very, very lucky and fortunate. I have a Patreon account that they've supported for a couple of years now, and it's allowed me to upgrade my system. It's allowed me to travel, and it's ridiculous at times and humbling to think that folks care enough about the show to support it. I'm very blessed and very honored to be able to get up here 3 times a week, put on the flesh mask, and amuse you guys. It's an actor's dream to be able to kind of have that a kind of a steady character and a steady world that you can play with, and an incredibly warm and receptive audience. So I'm really grateful. I'm grateful, folks like you, for bringing me out here, because this is a lot of fun, and I like being able to talk. As you can tell, I like being able to talk about what I do.
Awesome. Oh yeah, I love being able to talk as well. All right. Well, we are going to go ahead and wrap, albeit a couple minutes late, but you know what? It'll be all right. Let me double check on here. We're actually, in the chat, people are saying they did enjoy the interview, and hitting that subscribe button and all that good stuff. I don't know if that's for me or for you. I got the weird feeling that the guy talking in the chat is already a fan of your page.
I shared it around, so hopefully some folks came over.
Awesome. Well, I do appreciate you coming on. It's been a lot of fun. Even though
thank you so much, Lonnie.
The cat's trying to get in my lap, so I guess.
Yep.
But all right, yeah. Again, we appreciate it. This is Mr. Leeman Kessler of Ask Lovecraft. Check out his YouTube, Facebook, Twitter. All of the links are there on the video. We've been here the whole time, so. Also, be sure to check us out. We'll be on tomorrow morning. I use morning loosely. It'll be about noon. We'll be doing a live stream Borderlands 2 play, specifically for our buddy Glenn's birthday. He requested it this morning. So.
Oh, happy birthday, Glenn.
Awesome. So anyway, again, thank you very much for coming on, and we'll see everybody tomorrow. I'm Lonnie with Untitled Nerd Network, brought to you by Infinity Flux and your local Satanist, both out of the Chattanooga, Tennessee area. And this has been an amazingly fun interview with Mr. Leeman Kessler of Ask Lovecraft.
Thank you so much.